Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us today for the Safety and Health Magazine webcast sponsored by JJ Keller. We're going to let our audience settle in for just a minute and the presentation will start shortly. Thank you. Hello again, folks. Thanks for being with us today. We're going to start the presentation shortly. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast Fall Prevention Best Practices for Three Main Types of Hazards, sponsored by JJ Keller. My name is Barry Botino, and I'm an associate editor at Safety and Health and a co host of the On the Safe Side podcast. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's event. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to share with everyone. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorses those items. At the conclusion of today's event, we'll conduct a Q&A with our speakers. If you have a question, just click that Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question and press the send button. You can submit those questions via the Q&A at any time during today's event. After this presentation, you'll also be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, but I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. This webcast will be archived. If you want to view this presentation or any of our past webcasts, please go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. Now let's introduce our speakers. Joining us today are Ed Zaleski and Gina Godin. As a senior editor on the EHS team, Ed researches and creates content on various safety related topics. His areas of expertise include walking working surfaces, powered industrial trucks, injury and illness record keeping, and today's topic, fall prevention. Gina serves as an editor on the EHS team and has 10 years of hands on experience as a safety manager in the construction, mining, and manufacturing industries. She frequently writes about topics such as lockout tagout, personal protective equipment, confined spaces, and working from height. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. And Ed, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you everyone for joining us. Today's presentation is sponsored by JJ Keller Training. These training solutions cover a broad range of topics, and they're available in a variety of formats like training on demand, DVD, streaming video, and even video books. And this is all to help you meet your training needs. So this is backed by regulatory experts and uses the latest technology and techniques. So our training solutions can help you give your employees the instruction they need. So on behalf of our sponsor, thank you for joining us. All right, falls obviously are a leading cause of fatalities as well as injuries, so preventing them is critical. Now, how you go about doing that is the tough part. So today's webcast has two parts. To reduce the risk of falls, of course, you need to be aware of potential fall hazards. There's really three main types, at least that we're going to cover today. That's the unsafe environment, unsafe equipment, and of course, unsafe behaviors. So we'll discuss these, and then we're going to cover the strategies to eliminate or prevent falls. That's eliminating the hazards, using passive methods like guardrails or fall restraint systems, and using administrative controls like safety monitors, warning lines, designated areas, things like that. Now, if all of that isn't enough to prevent a fall or remove the hazard, then you're going to have to provide personal fall arrest systems and, of course, train workers how to use them and how to inspect them. So we'll cover how to do that too. And finally, if there is a fall, we're going to talk about having a plan to rescue the worker. Now, some falls cause more severe injuries than others. Falls from the same level result in a person, like falling to the floor or the ground, Typical examples are slips and trips, and these have a much higher frequency rate, but generally a lower injury severity rate. Now, that's not to say people can't get a severe injury falling on one level, but it tends to be lower. On the other hand, falls from elevation involve falling from one level to another. This could be from a mezzanine to a ground below, or even just from working on a ladder and falling from the ladder. These are less frequent, of course, but the injuries, as you can imagine, tend to be more severe. In fact, the velocity at impact when falling 12 feet is nearly 20 miles an hour, and a person hits the ground in less than a second at that distance. In fact, even if you're only 4 feet above a surface, you'll hit in half a second going about 11 miles an hour. And that's actually a typical running speed. So it's kind of like running full speed into a wall that you didn't see was there. You can imagine that can cause even pretty serious injuries too. All right, so we said to reduce the risk of falls, you need to identify potential fall hazards, and we're going to start with the unsafe environment. One example would be if an elevated surface does not have guardrails, well, there's a chance someone could fall off the edge. In fact, on the image here, you can see that a section of the guardrail is missing, or it's a sliding section that's open. Other environments that can lead to falls are uneven surfaces in a walkway or aisle, missing covers or missing grates over holes. And there can, of course, be trip hazards. Extension cords in an aisle is a common one. So for general industry and especially construction, things like rain or snow could cause an elevated surface to become slippery, increasing the chance that someone could slip or fall off an edge. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Gina a little bit to talk about equipment.
Okay, thank you, Ed. So, yeah, let's talk about unsafe equipment. So, take a look at this picture, and if you look closely, you can see that the harness here is damaged. It's frayed to the point where it's ripped through the stitching. So, remember, you have to train employees to look for damage. Some workers are kind of lax when it comes to inspecting their PPE, which is bad enough, but especially when it comes to fall protection, it's even more important. So, fall protection harnesses take a lot of abuse. They can get damaged without the worker even realizing it. So, that's why workers need to inspect their harness before each use. And the same thing goes for other fall protection equipment as well. Remind your employees to report any defects that they find to guardrails, warning lines, lanyards, or anything else that maybe just doesn't look right. So, a lot of this stuff can go unnoticed. Again, because employees are around it all the time and they can get complacent and they just don't notice it anymore. But again, that's where those periodic inspections and safety inspections can help. So when you do those walk around type inspections, make sure it's done by a safety committee or by workers who don't normally work in that area, because a fresh set of eyes can really help you identify problems that employees in the area simply don't notice anymore. Okay, so looking at this next slide, you can see here a picture of a stepladder, and we're going to talk about unsafe behavior. So, for example, you can see here that the stepladder is not locked into position and that the employee is starting to climb it. So maybe this person's in a hurry, maybe they're just careless or they don't think it's a big deal, but this is an example of unsafe behavior that we want to avoid. Now, ladders are used a lot, and employees often take them for granted. So, you might see employees using a ladder in an unsafe way, like leaning a step ladder against a wall, climbing up it to reach something up high on a shelf. But just because someone else was lucky enough not to get hurt doesn't make it okay. So, another thing related to unsafe behaviors is when employees skip the ladder inspection before using it. So, again, they might be in a hurry or they might think that, oh, I'm only going to use it for a quick minute or two. So, why bother inspecting it? It's going to take me longer to inspect this ladder than it actually is to use it. Um, but really, they still need to inspect the ladder before first use on each shift. And so, that's important to make sure that those inspections are taking place. And we're often asked if employers are required to document the ladder inspections. OSHA does not require the documentation, but you certainly can do it. They do require the inspection to take place, but they don't necessarily require documentation to go along with it. Now, remember, you are required to train employees on using ladders properly and on inspecting them. So you might need to remind them from time to time about the rules of ladders and enforce those rules, but make sure that you've trained them first. Okay, and so here's another example of unsafe behavior. When workers don't tighten the leg straps properly on their harness, as you can see in this picture here, they could suffer serious injuries in the event of a fall. So this usually happens when employees who don't wear fall arrest harnesses very often have to put them on, or if they're sharing equipment with other workers and it's not fitting them properly. So again, this is where effective training comes into play. So make sure you have the worker put the harness on and tighten it properly to fit their body. Make sure that the D-ring that the lanyard attaches to is properly positioned on the employee's upper back between the shoulder blades, and that the leg straps need to be properly tightened. Make sure you watch to see what other workers are doing and who might need refresher training. Always remind employees to adjust their straps, buckle their harnesses, do whatever they need to do in order to wear the equipment properly. Kind of goes back to that saying that if you see something, say something, right? So just like you might have to remind someone to wear their safety glasses, you might also need to say something if they're not wearing their fall protection properly. And with that, I'll pass it back to Ed.
Thank you, Gina. Now, both general industry and construction standards have training requirements. Now, the construction rule refers to a competent person, while the general industry refers to a qualified person. The requirements are otherwise pretty similar. Employers have to provide training on how to recognize the fall hazards in the work area, how to minimize or eliminate those hazards, and how to install, set up, inspect, operate, maintain, disassemble, and store any fall protection and equipment you use. So for construction, training is required for anyone who's exposed to fall hazards. In general industry, it's kind of similar. It's usually limited to people who use fall protection systems or if other standards specifically require training. I mean, if you're working on a mezzanine protected by guardrails, you don't actually need fall protection training, but if you use a system, then you probably do. Now, neither standard requires annual retraining, but both do require some retraining. That might be needed when changes in your workplace make the previous training invalid. Maybe there's a new fall hazard, maybe there's a new work procedure. You could do retraining when changes in your systems or equipment make your training invalid. That could be installing new equipment, might be a new type of fall protection, or employees getting into areas where they hadn't previously worked, they have new hazards. And of course, as Gina was saying, if you see or hear about a worker who seems to be lacking the understanding or skill to use the equipment properly, they would need retraining. Now, training is one of the most challenging areas for safety professionals. J.J. Keller Training on Demand can help you meet and exceed your OSHA training requirements. And beyond today's topic, J.J. Keller Training delivers 24/7 access to hundreds of online courses and streaming video across multiple platforms. So because J.J. Keller is sponsoring this event, we're offering everyone to take a new to request our new fall protection white paper. You can request information. I'm going to have a poll put up on your screen here. So use that poll on your screen to select your interests. And when you do, we will email you the white paper by the end of the week. I want to take just a moment here to remind everyone also, we are saving time for questions at the end. We've gotten a couple in. If you want to submit your question, you don't have to wait till the end, but please use the Q&A feature on your screen. I think the chat feature might be open, and we often have people posting a question in the chat area, but we aren't monitoring that quite as closely. So the Q&A feature allows us to organize a little bit more. If you put one in the chat by mistake, no problem. Please repost it in the Q&A area, and we will, like I said, we will hopefully have some time to take care of those at the end. We'll get as many questions as we can. And with that, I am going to move things back over to Gina to talk about some prevention strategies.
Okay, yes. Let's move on and cover the strategies for preventing falls. So the three that we're going to talk about today include eliminating the hazard, using passive, and using administrative controls. So under the hierarchy of controls, the basic idea is controlling a hazard at its source, which is the best way to protect employees. Elimination and substitution are always going to be the most effective, but they tend to be the most difficult to implement. So if you're still at the design or the development stage of your production process, it might be easier for you to eliminate the fall hazards. But for an existing process or for construction sites, Major changes in equipment and procedures may be required for you to actually eliminate or substitute out a hazard. And we recognize that that just isn't always feasible. So that brings us to our next best thing, which is engineering controls. Now, if the work environment can be physically changed to prevent exposure to the potential hazard, that's considered an engineering control. So, for example, a built in barrier or guardrail. Now, the initial cost of engineering controls can be higher than the cost of administrative controls or PPE, but the long term operating costs are usually much lower and, in some cases, can provide a cost savings. So, if employees can change the way they do their jobs, then the hazard can be reduced with a work practice control or an administrative control, which is next on our hierarchy. Administrative controls require the employer or the worker to do something. An example would be training workers or even reducing the time that an employee is exposed to the hazard. So, for example, reducing the amount of time that they're required to be working up on a ladder or exposed to a leading edge. Now, these methods are also generally less effective and they may require significant effort by the affected workers. But really, the first step is to identify the fall hazards and determine the best options for moving forward. And in order to do that, you need to conduct a hazard assessment. So, with a hazard assessment, you need to evaluate the workplace, identify sources of hazards, and then provide whatever PPE is necessary. So, OSHA's PPE regulation requires employers to assess the workplace to determine if hazards are present or are likely to be present, and that would require using personal protective equipment. The standard does not specify who must conduct or certify the hazard assessment. Really, anyone with the necessary skills and experience to identify hazards and select appropriate PPE can do it. The employer designates someone to do this, whether it's somebody internally or you contract that out for a third party, you do have some options there. But essentially, the hazard assessment is the best place to start. And I'll pass it back to Ed.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you, everyone. All right, so you characterize the nature of the hazards, you identify your control measures, and you prioritize them. All right, so the following could be options. As Gina was kind of hinting, you might find a new way of doing the job. Maybe there's different ways of reaching heights in the safest way possible. Maybe a mobile ladder stand is better than a step ladder. You can change work procedures. You might be able to reduce the frequency of doing a job. Or, as we said, you might provide personal protective equipment or fall protection for employees. In most cases where a worker will be exposed to a fall of 4 feet or more, and that's general industry, hopefully you have guardrails. But sometimes employees need to work on top of machines or other locations where people don't normally go. And frankly, putting in guardrails just might not be practical. So here's an example of that. In this image, the workers are tied off and wearing harnesses. They're on top of a machine. You can see it'd be hard to have guardrails up there. But one thing to think about is how they get up there. Maybe they climbed a ladder to get there. So the procedure would be they put on the harness, properly adjusted, before they climb the ladder. Then when they get to the top of the ladder, they hook a self-retracting lanyard onto the D-ring, and then they can step on top of the machine and they are protected from falls. Now, we do sometimes get questions, well, what if they're only going to be up there for 2 minutes? OSHA's take is there is no safe amount of time that someone can work in an elevated area without fall protection. If there's a hazard, they need fall protection. So this is why, as Gina was saying earlier, maybe putting on the harness and getting hooked up and everything takes longer, and inspecting the harness takes longer than the job. Well, that's the way it goes. Now, if possible, like I said, you can change or modify the physical conditions that create the hazards. If working from a ladder is possible, if a platform could be built around it with guardrails, maybe you could move the equipment closer to the floor so it could be reached with a step ladder. We do get asked sometimes, well, what fall protection should we use in this situation? And there's no single best answer. Everything's a lot of trade-offs, either costs and level of protection. All right, we also said that you can eliminate hazards by changing work procedures. Remember, not all falls occur from upper levels. Here's a trip hazard that could be eliminated with a procedure that requires putting extension cords and tools away. And that can apply to anything else related to housekeeping. In fact, OSHA's general industry standard for housekeeping, 1910-22, It's one of the most cited regulations. We all know cleanliness is next to impossible. I get that, but you do the best you can, put your procedures in. Another option is to reduce the necessity of doing a job or the frequency that it must be performed. Now, again, this contributes to safety only and it limits the amount of exposure time, but you do make every effort to eliminate hazards and prevent potential accidents by changing the physical or environmental conditions, but sometimes reducing the frequency can help also. All right, back to Gina.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to the second strategy for preventing falls, using passive methods. And again, that's going to be your engineering controls, such as guardrails, covers, and fall restraint systems. Now, here's an example of a passive method. Specifically, this one's designed for the restaurant industry. It's a floor mat. It's an anti-slip floor mat. So they're also specially designed mats for industrial and manufacturing facilities that can also help reduce slip hazards. Now, guardrail systems. This is probably one of the more commonly known passive systems, at least in the industrial setting. And guardrails prevent workers from falling to a lower level. And for general industry, some type of fall protection, guardrail being one example, is required at 4 feet or more. So according to OSHA, guardrails must meet these certain requirements. They have to have a top rail and a mid rail or vertical members. And the top rail must be able to withstand 200 pounds of outward or downward force. So it needs to be sturdy, it needs to be strong. And the mid rail must be midway between the top rail and the surface below. And the OSHA regulations do go into further detail as far as some of the exact dimensions and requirements around guardrail systems, both for temporary systems and permanent systems. But one of the common questions that I'll share is we often get questions on the vertical supports of these guardrails. So OSHA doesn't specify a maximum distance between the support posts as long as the structure can withstand the required force upon that guardrail system. Okay, so covers. This is another example. A cover is a secured removable cap that is strong enough to prevent workers from falling into or through a hole. So the strength of the cover is determined by the environment. So for example, do you have forklift traffic that will be driving over these covers? Or is it located in an area where there's only foot traffic? Regardless, all covers should be regularly inspected to ensure that they remain secure, intact, and that they can withstand the weight that they may be exposed to. And oddly enough, OSHA defines a hole as a gap that is only 2 inches or more in dimension. So you need to take the precautions to cover those holes and protect workers. Obviously, no one could fall through a hole that size, but it may contribute to a tripping hazard. So it makes sense that we still need to protect workers from those hazards. All right, so let's look at travel restraint systems. A lot of people might think that of this as more of a traditional fall arrest system, but it's actually different from fall arrest because a travel restraint system, it eliminates the possibility of a worker going over an edge. Basically, it lets you travel just far enough to reach the edge, but not far enough to fall over it. And this is a great diagram here that represents that. And a travel restraint system typically combines some kind of body support like a harness or a body belt, an anchorage point, an anchorage connector, and then a lanyard. So remember, the employee must inspect the system before using it, and that includes the anchor point, the harness, all components of that system. And with that, I'll pass it back to Ed.
All right, let's move on to ladder safety systems on fixed ladders. Boy, I get a lot of questions about these in the last few years. So a ladder safety system is designed to prevent falls when the worker's climbing the ladder. Typically includes a carrier, a sleeve, a body harness, a lanyard, and connectors. So the idea is if the worker slips, this safety sleeve will lock onto the carrier. It's often a cable up the middle, like you can see here. That locks on and it prevents the worker from falling. Now, a ladder safety system also allows people to work with both hands free or for climbing, and it lets them perform a task if they, stop climb part way up. It's kind of a handy system, and it should slide up without them needing to use their hands to slide it. Now, OSHA does require these on fixed ladders that are more than 24 feet high or with a 24-foot or more total falling distance. So if a ladder starts 10 feet off the ground and goes up 15 feet, well, that's a 25-foot fall. You need a safety system. Now, ladders that were already in place by November of 2018 might not have these yet. They need to be upgraded by November of 2036. So you have a few years left. But and also the other question I get asked about these, you actually don't need these ladder safety systems on ladders that are under 24 feet. So, if it goes to the roof of a building, you don't actually need one if it's only like 20 feet. You can put one in, but not required. All right, I want to take a quick poll question, and we're talking about incorrectly using fall protection. Have you ever caught an employee incorrectly using a fall protection or using damaged or faulty equipment? So this is just a straight yes or no. You can put your answers in. Now, I know a lot of you have probably caught employees working without fall protection where they should have it. That obviously happens all too often. And honestly, what I hear a lot from safety professionals is improperly storing fall protection equipment. I mean, people leave these harnesses out on the rigs over the weekend, or they throw them in the back of the truck. They get all scratched up and dirty. Not a good idea. But here we're asking now, if you have that damaged equipment, did somebody go ahead and use it anyway? Maybe they didn't realize it was damaged. Maybe they didn't notice, maybe they didn't inspect it, whatever, but were they improperly using it? I even had one idea saying somebody said they were on top of an equipment wearing their harness, but had never actually clipped up to the lanyard. So okay, hopefully you've had a chance to respond. I'm kind of curious to see what we get here. So let's have the results posted. If we kind of get some, are they going to display? I don't know. Gina, are they on your screen? Because I don't see them on my screen. Oh, there they are. There they are. Okay. Yes.
No,
Okay, we got them up here. 76% yes. That's what I've got here. So about 3/4 of you have caught people incorrectly using fall protection equipment or using damaged equipment. That is sadly high. I suppose over time, sooner or later, this is going to happen. And my guess is the 1 in 5, 4 of you, the 25% that said no, is probably going to happen to you at some point. Or, maybe you don't have that many workers who use fall protection equipment, so you could be better off there. But yeah, that's kind of interesting and a little depressing. But I guess for those of you who are up there, you're not alone. A lot of you have that. And again, I want to add, we're taking questions. We're still hoping to get some good questions coming in, and we will answer them later on in the webcast. So, all right. Let's move on to the third strategy for preventing falls, and that is using administrative controls. As we said, this is things like designated areas, warning lines, or safety monitors. I do get a lot of questions on using designated areas in general industry. You can use these in some cases. It's basically a warning line around an area, and then employees can work in that zone without other fall protection, even if you're up on a roof of a multi-story building. Now, these can only be used on low slope roofs, what we call flat roofs. Employees do need training on how to set up the area. Basically, designated areas can be used for temporary and infrequent work if the workers are at least 6 feet from the edge. That means occasional work, like monthly, that takes just an hour or so. OSHA gave the example of changing a roof-mounted AC filter once a month. In fact, OSHA has a letter from June 2020 that explains these terms temporary and infrequent if you need details, because they use temporary and infrequent in the regulations but didn't define them. That letter offers some great definitions. So the other way you could use a designated area is if your work is at least 15 feet from the edge. Here, the temporary and frequent is not required. If you're at least 15 feet from the edge, you set up your warning line, you could use a designated area even if the job's going to take 3 or 4 days. And finally, OSHA does say if the work is both temporary and infrequent and you're at least 15 feet from the edge, workers don't actually need fall protection, not even a designated area. So I get asked, well, how far from the edge can you be without fall protection? Technically, the answer is 15 feet if it's temporary and infrequent work. Now, the general industry regulations cover these in 3 different sections. The designated areas are mentioned in 28, 29, and 30. So make sure you know all the requirements if you use them. And again, you can only use this on low slope roofs. This can't be used on mezzanines or other elevated surfaces. All right, back to Gina again.
Okay, thank you, Ed. So, when engineering, work practice, and administrative controls are not feasible or they don't provide sufficient protection, employers must provide PPE to their workers. They need to make sure that the employees are using it consistently and properly. So, remember, PPE is the last line of defense, and examples of PPE for fall protection include, again, a personal fall arrest system, a travel restraint system, or positioning devices, because these all involve components that the workers actually need to put on and wear. So, personal fall arrest systems are used to stop an employee from a fall from an elevated level. So, these systems consist of the body harness, an anchorage, and a connector. Connections may include lanyards, deceleration devices, lifelines, or some sort of suitable combination. So, a personal fall arrest harness must have a maximum weight capacity defined by the manufacturer, and that needs to be included with the person and any tools or equipment that they may carry. Now, positioning devices are slightly different because it's not a full body harness necessarily. A positioning device is made up of the equipment, connectors. When used with a body harness or belt, it allows the worker to be supported on an elevated vertical surface, like a wall or a windowsill, and they can work freely with both hands. They're able to position their body in a way that allows them to do the work here. Okay, so we've talked about this a bit already, but workers must inspect their fall protection equipment before each use to identify any damage or defects. Inspections must also be done if workplace conditions change since the last inspection. So, for example, like when a body harness comes into contact with a hazardous chemical or it's exposed to excessive heat, then you need to be taking a closer look at those harnesses in those situations. Also, if a harness or a lanyard are involved in a fall incident, they need to not be used again until inspected. And generally, we take those out of service. You have to kind of look at the manufacturer's recommendations. But again, generally, we want to take those out of service if they've been used in a fall. Now, although not incorporated by OSHA, ANSI standard Z359.2 requires that fall protection equipment be inspected by a competent person at least every 12 months, and more often if required by the manufacturer. So this should be documented, but it doesn't say how to do that. OSHA can use that standard to apply the general duty clause for failing to maintain safe equipment. But again, this ANSI standard is not an OSHA standard. But if you do choose to follow that ANSI regulation, competent persons can come in and inspect all of your fall protection equipment at least every 12 months. Now, when inspecting your fall protection equipment, you need to check for damage, deterioration, broken parts. Pay particular attention to anything that can affect the integrity of the equipment, which can include anything that you see listed here. One safety professional told us that he got a brand new harness and took it out of the package and found a section where the stitching had come loose. So he ended up sending it back to the manufacturer and getting a replacement. But just a reminder that even new PPE should be inspected. You just never know. And with something like this, you don't want to take any chances. So with that, I'll pass it back to Ed.
All right, a little more on caring for fall protection gear. Obviously, it should be stored in a designated location. The area should be clean, cool, dry, protected from chemicals, protected from long-term sunlight. As I mentioned before, I've talked to a lot of people who said these harnesses, especially in construction, they're thrown in the back of a truck. They're left out in the rain and the sun all weekend long as people don't put them away properly. These things are not cheap. We want to make sure people are taking good care of them. Explain to employees that if they see any fall protection equipment not in use and not stored properly, they should follow your company's policy about removing it or reporting it. I mean, maybe they hang it up, but if they notice obvious damage on it, maybe that should be removed from service, like Gina was saying. And make sure employees report any damage or defects, and again, remove that from service. Maintenance should be performed according to the manufacturer's recommendations, but you're probably not going to have your employees sewing up the stitching or anything like that. You might replace it, see who can repair it, but that's going to be, again, by manufacturer recommendations. All right, now we're getting near the end, and then we're going to take your questions. We're getting a good load coming in. I like this. To wrap things up, though, we are going to talk about providing for prompt rescue of employees if there is a fall. Now, the construction regulation and the ANSI standard here in the slide both address this. General industry doesn't so much, but of course, it's a good idea to have something planned out. The requirements include establishing verbal contact within 6 minutes and rescue within 15 minutes to help avoid complications. Blood clots, when people are hanging there, all kinds of things can come up. Clots or problems can occur in less time, less than 6 or 15 minutes, for people with medical conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure. Now, blood clots in the legs might not be obvious, so medical attention should be provided once the person has been rescued. And in fact, once they're down, it's important to keep the torso and head elevated in case any clots break free. These things can cause serious health issues, even heart attacks. And then, of course, you'll want someone who went through this experience to get a medical evaluation. But for that, talking about the plan, I'm going to turn it right back to Gina for a bit.
Okay, thank you. So there are 3 components to consider for your fall rescue plan. First, who performs the rescue? So you need to consider both internal and external resources. On-site workers must have a plan to rescue or help the worker while waiting for other outside resources to respond. So brainstorm the plan and work with local rescue providers. This can help coordinate the response between on-site workers and the outside responders. And then number 2, consider where the rescue might need to be done. So think about the fall hazards at the job site. This will depend on the tasks and the environment, but you're going to need to think critically through each different scenario. And then finally, think about what equipment you need to get the worker down to the ground. This will depend on, again, the fall arrest systems used and the location. But if someone falls from the top of a machine in the middle of a factory, what equipment could get to that location? Also considered where the worker could end up after falling. Because remember, it's not always a fall straight down. You have to think about the swing radius of someone who's working from a horizontal lifeline or using a longer SRL. So the worker may be unconscious or injured. There's a lot of different factors that kind of go into play. But the equipment needed can vary from a ladder to a scissor lift. You might have to get creative and think of other solutions, but you want to have a safe and efficient rescue plan in place. And one of the reasons you need to have a rescue plan in place is because timing is of the essence after a fall. Ed talked about this a little bit already, but prolonged suspension can cause a condition called orthostatic intolerance, or more commonly known as suspension trauma. And it can result in serious injuries or even death. It could not be the fall that kills this person, but it could be the resulting suspension trauma. So a person could become unconscious and die as a result of this trauma in less than 30 minutes. So essentially, when someone has been suspended in a harness, the blood flow to the legs is restricted, and the body still uses oxygen from that blood. But when the person is released, all that low oxygen blood flows around the body and rushes throughout their system, and that can cause more serious health problems. OSHA recommends knowing the signs and symptoms and helping prepare for them. So that all goes back to fall protection training. That suspension trauma aspect should be included in your fall protection training program. So again, your rescue plan should include procedures on handling the worker to avoid post-rescue injuries. You should also consider or include the following. Number 1, if self-rescue is impossible or if rescue cannot be performed properly, the worker should be trained to pump his or her legs to activate the muscles and reduce the risk of blood pooling. So footholds can be used to help relieve pressure. A lot of fall arrest harnesses these days come with footholds that can be deployed so that employee can slide their foot in them and help relieve some of that pressure. And then we also need to be monitoring the suspended worker for signs and symptoms of suspension trauma. We need to ensure that a worker receives medical evaluation after a rescue. Even if there doesn't seem to be any apparent injuries or signs of trauma, it's still important to get them evaluated because when it comes to internal injuries, those things aren't always visible. And so we just need to take that precaution and get them evaluated. Now, if the worker is unconscious, keeping the worker's air passages open and obtaining first aid is important too. When you think about if somebody's unconscious and they're, suspended and hanging from a fall arrest system, their airway could close. So again, timing is of the essence to get them down. So getting evaluated by a healthcare professional, again, the worker should be hospitalized when appropriate. You're going to leave those decisions up to the medical team. But there could also be possible delayed effects. We've seen cases where even kidney failure can happen, again, kind of related to that suspension trauma and internal injuries. But again, it's difficult to assess on the scene, so just don't hesitate to get that person evaluated. And with that, I'll pass it back to Ed. We have just a couple more slides to go through here today.
Yep, and we're getting great questions, so keep sending those in. Again, if you had put them in the chat, please move it over to the Q&A. We're not quite looking at the chat nearly as much if you had a question you put out there. All right, so today we discussed the three main types of hazards: the unsafe environment, unsafe equipment, and unsafe behaviors. Employers are obviously responsible for providing a safe work environment, but OSHA says employers are also responsible for, addressing any unsafe behaviors. That's where training things come in, training and reinforcement to address the behaviors. And then we covered some strategies and best practices to prevent falls, like eliminating the hazards, using passive methods like guardrails, or using administrative controls like safety monitors. This reminds me, I just talked to a professional recently who said they had a wet process with so many slip, trip, and fall injuries, same level injuries, that they found it was less expensive to have a non-slip coating reapplied to the floor every year. That was still cheaper than dealing with all the cases of the injuries because they had so many of them on a wet process. So yeah, you're eliminating the hazard might look expensive, but it can actually be cheaper in the long run. And then, of course, we talked about training workers on the use of personal fall arrest systems and how to inspect them. And Gina just talked about having a rescue plan. So before we move on to our Q&A session, I'd like to once again mention the sponsor of today's webcast, JJ Keller Training. Whatever your company's needs, JJ Keller Training can help with 24/7 access to hundreds of online courses and streaming video across multiple industries. So I'm going to put a poll up on your screen, and please use the poll to indicate your interests. We're offering today's attendees a chance to reserve a copy of our white paper on fall protection when you select one of the options on the poll. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to our hosts and see if they have any wrap-ups, and then we're going to go through some of your questions.
Well, thank you, Ed, and thank you, Gina, for sharing your knowledge with us today. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to let everyone know about the evaluation survey that we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar, and your input is really important to us because it does help us to improve our future webcasts. Now, let's get to some of those questions. First of all, Gina, I'm going to start with you. A question from an attendee who'd like to know, are there requirements for properly disposing of fall protection gear?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And as far as disposing of fall protection equipment, if you know that you're going to take something out of service because it's damaged, you don't want anyone to use it, I would encourage you to cut that harness and put a tag on that harness. Make it clear and obvious that this harness is not to be used, that it's going to be disposed of. That way, nobody will accidentally take that harness and use it if you have identified defects or damage. Make it obvious that the harness is to be disposed of. So cut it, put a tag on it, do what you need to do to make sure that it's clear and obvious that that harness is not to be used.
Excellent. Ed, we got a couple questions that popped up about dock doors. And first wanted to start with this one. For loading dock doors that are 4 feet high, what are the requirements to protect employees from this hazard? Will safety chains suffice? And I think we've got you on mute, Ed.
Sorry, I was
That's okay.
having a little technical difficulty there. So safety chains can be used across a dock, and we do get all questions about that. We said fall protection is required at 4 feet or more, and a typical loading dock is about 48 to 52 inches. So that is going to be a fall. You do need some kind of protection if the dock door is open and there's no truck in place. So a lot of people leave these open for ventilation and things like that. Chains, when we say guardrail, you need a guardrail system. A lot of people think, well, solid metal structures or solid wood structures, you can use chains if they meet the requirements. So again, able to withstand 200 pounds of force and are at the ideal height. In fact, the federal OSHA standard even mentions that if you're using things like rope for the top rail, you need to inspect it to ensure it meets the strength requirement. Clearly, they allow rope as a top rail. They could allow chains too. The other challenge is the sag, because when you have a flexible material, it's going to sag a little bit in the middle. And OSHA says it cannot, under a 200-pound load, cannot deflect to within 39 inches of the surface. Now, if you're familiar with guardrail standards, you know it's 42 inches height plus or minus 3 inches. Well, 42 minus 3 is 39. So if that top rail sags less than 39 inches to the surface, it doesn't meet the guardrail requirements. So that's where
Okay.
that actually comes from.
Great. And as a follow-up to that question, Ed, we got another question from another attendee who asked about uh, with a dock door with a 4 foot or higher drop, would 1 or 2 chains be required in that instance?
You actually need 2 at minimum, because Gina was covering guardrails earlier, and you need a top rail and a mid rail. So a single chain is not going to be enough. Even if
Hmm.
you hang a sign on it saying keep back or fall hazard or something, you actually need a standard guardrail. So it's got to have that top chain sagging no more than 39, and then a middle, at least a middle chain, a mid rail chain. I mean, you could put up 3 or 4 if you really want, but you do need at least 2.
Okay, excellent. Gina, we had a question come in about equipment, and someone says, I had someone take a brand new harness out of the package and write their name on it with a Sharpie. I was told by another professional that this will no longer pass inspection because it is now compromised. Is this correct?
Yeah, so that's a great question. This is one of those things that there's some debate within the industry on. So the concern here is not necessarily the Sharpie or the marker itself. Um, and OSHA doesn't have any specific regulations prohibiting that. However, when it comes to inspecting the harness, the concern is that if you take a marker or if you write on the harness, you could be covering up damage or defects, or even if it's not intentionally you're trying to hide the damage or the defects, it just makes it that much harder to see when you're doing an inspection, to see a burn hole, for example, or
Hmm.
to see, stitches or tearing or fraying or something like that. So that's where this concern comes in. It's a best practice not to write on the harnesses. Instead, write on the label, on the manufacturer's label, where you're not going to cover anything up that's important to see. Those labels are quite small, but usually you'll find enough room within that label or somewhere else to be able to write somebody's name on it. But that's where the concern comes in, is it just makes it harder to identify damage or defects if you're writing on those harnesses.
Excellent information. Thank you for that, Gina. Um, Ed, I wanted to, somebody like a little clarification. You mentioned infrequent work and being greater than 15 feet from an edge of a flat roof. Can you kind of clarify the distance that you mentioned and the surrounding issues around those designated areas?
Yeah, and I think I saw that one. Somebody said, yeah, "Did you say if I'm at least 15 feet from the edge doing temporary frequent, I don't even need a designated area?"
Right.
So yeah, so normally, as we were talking, when you're working at heights, you need some type of fall protection. Things like harnesses, guardrails, that's what we call conventional fall protection. A designated area is a little non-conventional, but OSHA still considers a designated area to be a type of fall protection. The standard, and I had the paragraphs listed on one of the slides, so you can go back and look at them. But it was now I forget, was it in 1910 28? I think, not 29. I think it's in 28, but it could be. And OSHA said, they went through the 6 feet is okay if it's temporary and infrequent. And they said if it's 15 feet or more, you can use a designated area, even if the work is not temporary and infrequent. And it does say if the work is 15 feet or more and qualifies as temporary and infrequent, it says you don't need fall protection. So that would mean you don't need as a designated area either, because a designated area is a type of fall protection. Now, there are other requirements. I mean, you need to implement and enforce a rule that prohibits anyone from getting within 15 feet of the edge. So they can't be up there doing a job and then wander over to see what's happening in the parking lot below. That would be exposed to a fall hazard. So there are some rules and restrictions for training the people who are going to be doing that. But yeah, technically, if you're at least 15 feet from the edge and it's temporary and frequent work or quick job, you don't need fall protection. You don't even need a designated area. That's what the
Okay.
regulation says.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Ed. Appreciate the clarification. Gina, back to equipment. We had a attendee ask if a fall protection harness is taken care of, per the manufacturer's instructions. What kind of average lifespan if can we hope that piece of equipment will have?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So, and the key part being if it's taken care of well, if it's inspected properly, still in good condition. Um, in terms of OSHA, there is no hard and fast, lifespan or duration. We always refer back to the manufacturer's recommendations. So, depending on who the manufacturer is, they might recommend replacing the harness every 5 years, every 7 years, every 10 years. It's going to vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, but we always say, check the label, check the manufacturer's recommendations on that.
Excellent. Um, Ed wanted to ask you if only a partial guardrail system is in place, um, should a fall protection harness be used in that case?
Yeah, if the guardrail, we gave a example earlier, if the guardrail's open, if the guardrail is not offering protection from the fall hazards, then you're going to need something else. It doesn't necessarily have to be a personal fall arrest system. It could be a travel restraint system that prevents someone from going in there. One of the challenges we see with that, of course, is that even a travel restraint system needs an anchor point or an anchorage. And while OSHA says that might be 5,000 pounds or twice the anticipated working load, but you can't just tie off to whatever happens to be handy or nearby when you're so yeah, if there's a gap or an opening, you do need some protection. In fact, one of the standards, the general industry standards talking about fall protection, does say, like, if you have a gate at a loading area that you're opening so that a forklift can bring something up, they did say if somebody's going to be at the edge while that gate's open, they do need to be wearing some other type of fall protection, whether it's a fall arrest or positioning, or excuse me, travel restraint system, something like that. So yeah, if there's a gap, they're going to need something else to stop them from going through.
Okay, great. Gina, we had a couple questions coming in regarding load testing anchor points. Is there any kind of annual requirement or any requirement at all to do that?
Yeah, so there's not an annual load testing requirement. Some employers do this as part of their policy and best practice, and that's great. OSHA just says that your anchor point has to be able to withstand that 5,000 pounds of force, or be able to support 5,000 pounds, rather. But there's not an annual testing requirement or load certification requirements or anything like that. It may be a best practice and a good idea to do that, but it's not an ongoing requirement. You just have to make sure that the anchor point is sufficient.
Okay, excellent. Ed, I wanted to ask you, you talked about two different training standards, and one talked about a competent person and one a qualified person. Can you tell us, is there any difference between those two roles, and could that role be served by a worker, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we often get asked if there's a special certification required to be a competent person or qualified person, or what training they need. OSHA doesn't outline that. It's kind of knowledge based, and I'll probably have to turn to Gina a little bit on some of this, but the employer decides, does this person have the knowledge, experience, abilities to convey information, to recognize hazards. Usually what it means is you're able to recognize hazards, and that you're able to address issues. Some of them say you need the authority to address any issues as well. I think I forget if that's in the competent or qualified, but you look up the standard that you'd have to have the authority to actually say, hey, stop work. This is unsafe, and we have to get this taken care of. And Gina probably has a little bit more to add on that.
No,
Certainly.
I think you actually covered it great, Ed. The only thing I'll add is that I think when people ask this type of question, because we see this a lot too, um, is really what people want to know is there some sort of certification or something that I need to receive as a fall protection trainer or as a someone who's responsible for inspecting the equipment. You don't need any special certification or any fancy training or anything like that. It's really, like Ed said, you just need to be competent and qualified and aware of the hazards. You have to know what you're looking for. You have to be familiar with what the OSHA regulations say. So there's really no certification process or anything that you need to receive.
Okay, excellent. Um, Ed, we had a attendee share a little story here, and this person says, we had contractors working on our flat roof. They were not tied off. We did try and put up a barrier 3 foot from the side. Is that an OSHA no-no, and could we possibly get a fine for that?
All right, I'm going to have Gino jump in, but let me give you a little bit here too. She's way up on contractor stuff. First of all, if none of your employees are exposed to the hazard, then I think the contractor is the one who's going to get fined because it's
Okay.
their employees who are exposed. So you should be okay. When you say barrier, it depends on what it is. I mean, if you put up a temporary guardrail 3 feet from the edge, that should be good. If you put up a warning line, at least in general industry, it's got to be at least 6 feet from the edge. So that would be the issue, that the 3 foot barrier. Now, and I don't know if Gina's going to address if you tried to get the contract, did something to try and protect the contractor. It might depend on what actions you took. Gina knows all about multi-employer work sites. So
Yeah, I do. And the unfortunate answer is it depends. Because OSHA is going to look for who's creating the hazard, who's controlling the hazard, who's ultimately responsible for protecting those particular employees from the hazard. Sometimes it is the host company, sometimes it is the contractor. Sometimes OSHA will double dip and cite both employers if they can. So it really depends on the situation and who's ultimately responsible. Um, Now that being said, you have to do the best you can. It sounds like you made an effort, you put the barrier up, like Ed said, make sure it's a sufficient barrier and not just, flagging or rope, which we often see driving around at construction sites. But you have to keep in mind also, like Ed said, for the designated area, it's 6 feet, not just 3. So unless it's a substantial physical barrier, 3 feet is fine. But if it's just a rope or flagging or, signs or something less sufficient than that, then you need to at least put it back at 6 feet.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Jeannie, we had a question come in regarding manufacturer labels, and this person wants to, if you could just share a little information about what should people look for in a manufacturer label? What kind of information will they find there?
Yeah, sure. So when you're doing your inspections, first of all, make sure that that label is present. That's important because that label will tell you, um, again, the load capacity that harness is capable of, the maximum load limit for that harness. So, and again, that not only includes the weight of the worker, but any tools or equipment or things that they might be carrying. So, what is the weight limit for those harnesses? And you will find, harnesses with different ratings. So, um, that's important to know, especially if workers are sharing harnesses or if you have a limited number of harnesses in stock. You need to make sure that the employee is wearing something that's sufficient to hold them and support them. So that's the main thing to look for. But again, the manufacturer label may have other information on there as well, such as expected, replacement time. So it will say on there, what their recommendation is for that. So manufacturer information, if you have questions or if you need to contact them, you'll be able to look that up on the label as well.
Great. That's a great point too, Gina. I'm sure manufacturers' websites would have some great information as well, such as care and things like that. Oh, perfect. Looks like we have time for one more question today. And Ed, I'm going to ask you, an attendee wants to know, at what height would it be unsafe to work on a ladder, or at what point would it require fall protection?
For fixed ladders, it's 24 feet or more that you need that ladder safety system. For portable ladders, 1910-28 duty to have fall protection literally says this section does not apply to portable ladders. So if you're using a portable ladder, you don't need fall protection. Usually there's no place to anchor to anyway. I mean, you'd have to have a SRL from the ceiling or something. So yeah, if you're climbing a portable ladder, even if you're more than 4 feet off the ground to change a light bulb or whatever, you don't actually need fall protection. There's where the training's important so people aren't leaning far out to one side. That's what's going to cause the fall most likely, or trying to climb or descend using no hands if you're carrying other unsafe behaviors are the big issue there. But yeah, there's no requirement for fall protection on portable ladders.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. Folks, unfortunately, we have run out of time today. We thank you all for attending this presentation, and we'd appreciate you taking just a little bit of time to share your feedback via our survey. A special thank you goes out today to our tremendous presenters, Ed Zaleski and Gina Godin, and of course, everyone from our sponsor at JJ Keller. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. Take care, everyone, and have a safe day.